My name is Mikko Hypponen. I'm the Chief Research Officer at F-Secure. We're going to talk about Conficker, the biggest virus news of the year. And it's kind of funny because we don't get virus outbreaks anymore. We just don't. Not the scale of what we saw here. But we used to. It used to be commonplace that we got virus outbreaks with viruses that infected thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds and thousands, millions of computers around the world. And this is the way viruses used to be. All the way from the 1990s to early 2000s, outbreaks were the norm with viruses like Melissa and Love Letter and so on. All the way until viruses like Slammer and Blaster and Sasser and Bagel and Netsky and MyDoom, which takes us to 2004. Then it stopped. From there on, things changed. Around 2003, 2004, the hobbyist virus writers who were writing viruses which would spread as quickly and as fast and as far as they could retired or went professional. And professionals don't want to write viruses which go around the world and infect as many computers as possible because that gets you on the front cover of New York Times. And if you're writing viruses for a living, you don't want to end up on the cover of the New York Times. Quite the opposite. And we saw the era of botnets, where the maintainers of the botnets on purpose try to keep them below the horizon. Try not to infect too many computers in 2 hours or within 24 hours, because that only gets you noticed. So that's 2004. No major outbreaks at the same scale that we were seeing with viruses like Blaster and Sasser for 2005, 2006, 7, 8, and then we got Conficker. Started actually at the end of 2008, went on until basically May of this year. Since then we've seen no activity from the gang, but the malware is still very much out there at this moment. It is huge still today. So how huge? Aaron Kaplan from CERT Austria actually made a very nice KML file for Google Earth that my computer just can't run. It's way too large, but I have a animation which shows part of the thing what it's supposed to look like when you run it in Google Earth for real. I really wish I could show it what it looks like when you can actually do it. But this gives you some kind of idea of what the infections were looking like when things were peaking in April with Conficker D and Conficker E. Talking about hundreds of thousands of infection attempts an hour. And this is really at the level of activity which, you know, old-timers in the industry sure remember, but people who haven't been really following viruses for more than 5 years really hadn't seen activity of this scale. And there were many different variants. The first one indeed already in November didn't cause much of a splash, but Conficker B around New Year was the biggest, the real wake-up call with Conficker. First week of January we saw around 10 million infected computers around the world. So what makes Conficker different? In addition of the fact that it infected way too many computers compared to most other malware we see. Well, Conficker was very well done. The gang behind Conficker were no fools. They knew their stuff, they knew coding, they knew code development, code cycles, they knew crypto, and they were clever. And they were watching us, their enemy, the security industry. And there were many techniques that we saw in Conficker. Some of it was pretty usual, some of it was for the first time ever. A couple of examples. First thing it kills when it boots up on a computer is it kills Wireshark. Kills autoruns, kills Gmer, kills procexp. Also kills any process which contains the string config in this process name. So all the Conficker removal tools, for example. Uses pretty nice techniques to detect virtual machines. These are not specific to VMware or any specific virtual machine, but they seem to detect basically everything we could find. Disables things like Windows updates and Security Center and error reporting back to Microsoft. Also, nicely enough, reserts the Windows System Restore point. So if you boot up from an infected computer and you choose from the Windows boot up selection menu to boot up to the last known good configuration, there is no last known good configuration. It removes it. Very nice tricks with ACLs. It modifies the access control list both in the files it drops and in the register keys it creates to basically to levels where even the local admin cannot remove the files or cannot remove the keys. Very nice. And also used crypto, 3 different crypto algorithms, RC4, RSA, nothing special there, but it also used MD6. And at the time when Conficker B shipped, at the end of last year, nobody was yet using MD6. MD6 was brand new. This was the first case I ever saw MD6 being used anywhere, and this was a goddamn virus. There was a vulnerability, or at least a bug in MD6, which was announced by the university team behind MD6 later on in the spring. 2 weeks later, we found a new version of Conficker which fixed the bug in Conficker. So spreading vectors, how it goes around. There's 3 different methods on how it gets from one machine to another. One is vulnerability, one is USB sticks, and one is shares. So if we just look at the typical corporate network, because this was largely a corporate network worm, once one single machine gets infected, very typical end result in that company was that all the other computers got infected. All laptops, all desktops, all servers. Especially this happened when one of the domain administrators logged onto an infected machine, or he happened to have a password which wasn't strong enough. So in Windows networks, one Windows computer which has authenticated itself to the domain can ask other Windows machines questions like, hi, what kind of accounts do you have? And the machines will answer back nicely that, well, anybody with the account name administrator or Jack or Jill can log to my computer. Once Conficker learned that, then it tried logging with those account names and with a list of actually pretty simple, pretty basic passwords. This list wasn't very long at all, but provided to be successful enough in corporate networks because these were soft targets. They were behind the firewalls. My personal favorite of all the passwords it was trying, change me. In addition, it also used the exploit, MSO 867. The way it did this is that it opened up a TCP port, high port on the infected computer. Then it tries exploiting other computers in the local area network with a bytecode which would connect back to the server or to the other machine which sent the exploit and download the actual payload from the high port, which was now open. It first scans the internal network, then it starts scanning the public IP address range, basically the whole world, the whole IPv4 address space, except there's a couple of these black holes which it will not touch. It tries to go through all the 42 billion IPv4 addresses, except maybe 30 spaces which it will never touch. So we resolved who owns these IP address spaces. Well, they belong to different antivirus companies, different certs, to Microsoft. For example, our IP range is right there, and so on and so on. So these guys had done their homework. They figured out where the enemy is and it will not hit our systems. It also will not accept any connections coming in from these IP ranges. Then it has the USB spreading technique. And USB worms are not news. USB worms have been around in Windows for almost 4 years now. Typically, USB worms work with autorun files like this one. This is not Conficker. This is some agent variant from 2 years ago. Basic idea is that if you have a file called autorun.inf at the root of your USB stick, Windows will parse that and will execute. In this case, it would run a file called ntdelect.com, which would be a binary file sitting on the root of the USB stick. That's what normal USB worms look like. When we were looking at Conficker, it was dropping autorun in files, but they look nothing like this. In fact, they look like this. Binary garbage. In fact, 3 of our analysts initially all separately decided that there's a bug in the code. Obviously, it's trying to write a text file, but it somehow copies a binary file there instead. Well, that's not correct. These are big files, around 40K binary, random chunk, every time different stuff. But if you just simply keep staring at the file, if you just keep looking at it, simply keep looking at it, you will eventually see that there are these plain text keywords in there. Autorun, open folder, icon, shell execute. This is actually perfectly valid autorun in file. Windows will parse and happily execute this file, no questions asked. Now, when we spoke with companies around the world, when Conficker was speaking about these problems and we spoke about USB problems, the typical answer we would get was that, okay, fine, we're glad to hear that we're glad that you told us about this risk, but it's not going to be a problem in our company because in our company autorun is disabled. And then we went and took a look and typically it wasn't. And it's really easy to get autorun disabling wrong. There are many ways to get it wrong. And after that, you still have the autoplay functionality. Autoplay is the functionality in Windows which will automatically prompt you when you put in a USB stick or a CD-ROM. And if it has movies, it will prompt to play the movies. If it has images, it will prompt to show the images. Well, with Conficker, the autoplay dialog looks like this. Option right here, the default option, open folder to view files. Then there are other options. Option number 2 is also open folder to view files. In fact, the first option, the default option here, when you click on it, it will not open a folder to view files. It will run Conficker. In fact, if we go back to my previous slide, you'll see, well, open folder to view files, and picks up the icon from the system folder, the icon of a folder. So it looks like the default setting looks exactly what you think you're supposed to be doing, but that's the selection which will actually run the work. No surprise that this actually worked fairly well. And this is yet another trick which we had never seen before in any other work. First in Conficker. So this got around pretty well, but the main thing that we were worried about was the motives, like what are they planning on doing with this, and how do they communicate. So let's have a look at just one infected computer. It will start to make outbound connections, and these outbound connections will try to go to domains. Domains like that. So the first version of Conficker, we're using random or semi-random domains, which would be calculated based on date and time. So every day there would be a selection of domains that the gang behind Conficker could pre-calculate and register. And the idea here was that instead of having one central domain where all the machines would connect to, they have a huge pool of potential domains, which means it's much harder for antivirus companies and security companies to locate and shut these down. In fact, because most of them don't exist. They have not been registered by anybody. But the only thing the attacker has to do is just to calculate one of the domains for tomorrow, register one of the possible domains, put up a web server there, put a certain file in a certain folder, and tomorrow all the infected machines will go and download that file. And even better, they will not execute the file unless the file has been signed with MD6. And the only one who has the key to sign it are the gang behind Conficker. So we can't even use this to send removal tools to all the infected users because we don't have the key. Well, this is around this time the Conficker working group started appearing. This is the during my 19 years in this industry, this is probably the best example of industry wide cooperation to work together to fight a common threat. Key players include Microsoft and ICANN and basically all the major antivirus vendors, many registrars, and we all work together to analyze this and to fight back with this domain generation algorithm. Excellent cooperation. However, the gang wasn't stupid. They were following very carefully about developments like these. For example, Conficker early on was using domain names like these. And if you just ignore the domains and look at the top, the TLDGs, well, let's get rid of the duplicates. We actually end up with 8 different top-level domains where all these domains were: .com, .cc, .cn, .org, .ws, and so on. So we only had to talk to 8 domains to get these potential domains shut down before the Conficker gang would take over them and use them to actually operate their botnet. Then the next version of Conficker came around, and instead of using 8 top-level domains, they used 116 top-level domains. So, Czech Republic, Kenya, Vietnam, Spain, you just pick the country. And of course, the gang behind Conficker must have been so sure that there's absolutely no way we could shut down all the domains from so many countries. However, that's exactly what the Conficker working group did. So that's a very good example of the level of cooperation we were able to pull off, which really is pretty amazing. Early on in the process, when we were trying to connect, or the Conficker working group was trying to find the right contacts in each of these top-level domains, here's one map which was maintained by the working group. Here in gray are the countries which are not being used by Conficker at all. The countries in blue are countries which are being used by Conficker top-level domains, which we had found a contact to, which we would cooperate with, and red was the ones which we hadn't yet found someone to talk to which would actually work with us. A couple of days later, the next map, the last country, actually only one country left, that's the Democratic Republic of Congo, which was the last country to be reached, and even them we did reach, and they did cooperate. So it was a success in the end. That wasn't though obvious at the time because this was around April, and April 1st was when the hype was peaking because Conficker was changing operating modes. We weren't really expecting anything to happen on April 1st. It would have been kind of stupid for the Conficker group to take use of their new updating mechanism on the very day when it changes because everybody's watching. So April 1st came and nothing happened, and the media decided it was a joke or it was hype or this is not interesting. And April 1st went, and we got coverage like never before.
Policy across the federal government. No single agency has the responsibility or authority to match the scope and scale of the challenge. Indeed, when it comes to cybersecurity, federal agencies have overlapping missions and don't coordinate and communicate nearly as well as they should with each other or with the private sector. We saw this in the disorganized response to Conficker, the internet worm that in recent months has infected millions of computers around the world.
Has any of you ever before heard a US president name any single computer virus by name? I sure haven't. So April 1st went, nothing happened, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 6th, nobody was looking anymore, and then April 8th came around, and that's when they actually used the new updating mechanism, or actually they used their peer-to-peer updating mechanism to ship out the next version of Conficker. That's the last we basically have seen from the gang. A couple of examples on how they were watching us. They were obviously reading our blogs, maybe, who knows, maybe they even had infiltrated the working group. I wouldn't like to think that happened, but these guys were really good in changing the operations. Here's a snippet from our blog from, March, when we were explaining to users who were working from infected computers and tried to access our website. And people can't access our website, f-secure.com, from an infected machine because Conficker prevents it. So we created an alternative site with a different name. So instead of coming to f-secure.com, go to f-secure.com as one word. And that's not being blocked by Conficker. Well, next version came around. Of course, they blocked f- and f-secure as one word. We just can't win. Maybe we should start using these random domains like they are using. Another good example, Dan Kaminsky joined the working group during spring as well with very good insight, great help. And of course, the next version of Conficker came around. It also blocked doxpara.com. I took the screenshot today. It wasn't very hard to make a screenshot where doxpara wasn't accessible. It's down. And if you look at where the machines are right now, this is a huge problem. There's more than 1 million infected computers right now around the world. Most of them are not here. Most of them are not in USA. Most of them are not in West Europe. Most of them are in countries, developing countries of various kinds, like Brazil and China and Vietnam. And that's where the problem is right now, and it's not really going away. A couple of data points on how much traffic Conficker is generating. Again, data coming from the working group. This is 6 days ago, and after that, how many unique IPs are seen, how many ASNs are seen. It's still obviously a huge problem. To put some perspective on this, if you look at the attacks 2 weeks ago, the denial of service attacks against South Korean websites and American websites, that was coming from a botnet with at most tens of thousands of infected machines. Botnet of this size could do pretty much anything they wanted if they wanted to. The problem is they can't do much because they're being watched so carefully, or maybe they had some other plan from the beginning. And we've had over the years different bounties being put on the head of virus writers. Some of these have been successful. For example, Sven Jaschen from Germany was caught with one of these bounties, and there's a $250,000 bounty on the head of the authors of Conficker. Nobody's picked it up. And over the years, we've seen virus writers being caught. We've been successful in tracking down many of these guys. Many of these have been convicted. Some of these have gone home free, unfortunately. But with the history behind what's been going on with Conficker and the motives and the gang itself, it is still unclear. This is footage related to, if you saw the talk from FBI agent Mularski. One of the arrests coming from the dark market case was this Gagietai Evyaban, who's being arrested right here. He's the guy in the black t-shirt. This is from Istanbul. That's their server operations, which is a great bust because these guys had no time to delete any data or even log out from their computers. Unfortunately, nothing like this has happened with the Conficker gang. In fact, the whole point of my talk was to drill down on the gang itself and what we know about it and what we know about their motives. But I got called last week and I was asked that because of ongoing investigations, I should end my presentation here. So thank you very much. I will not be taking any questions.